Welcome to The Human Edge. This week's guest is Richard Morris. Richard is co-founder and CEO of a charity called The Giving Machine, and he also works with entrepreneurs. This was a great conversation, talking about his time in Silicon Valley, talking about his time as CEO right now. What was interesting to me was a lot of the conversation was about giving, was about service, was about leadership and vulnerability, especially vulnerability in men, and how that's definitely a strength and not a weakness. I really enjoyed the conversation. I hope you do. And if you do, please share, please subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. Thanks for coming in today.
Thank you.
I'm noticing the T-shirt with it looks like a heart-shaped logo with cogs.
Well, it's representative of a charity I co-founded called The Giving Machine. It just so happens that Tuesdays is the day in which I have a context of working in the charity. So without thinking, I just put this T-shirt on it. I hadn't thought more about it than that.
Well, it gives me an opportunity to ask you about it, at least. What does the charity do?
Well, it all came about, to be honest, with... I'm just trying to think where to start, but I'll keep it relatively short. But essentially, I'd come back from working in the States, which we might touch on a bit later, but I always knew I wanted to do something it sounds a bit twee, but to give back. Mm-hmm. And but I was a bit frustrated for a while because I wasn't quite sure what that was going to be. And it wasn't until I started talking to a friend of mine, Jonathan, saying, look, I'd love to build a company to give money away. How do we do it? And he came up with a mechanism and said, well, shall we do this? Mm. And we teamed up with two other local people to form a sort of nucleus of a leadership team. And that's what we did. And it was called The Giving Machine, still is. Mm. And its purpose really was to put more money back into community organisations. Really built out of the fact that some of us at that time had been or were parents of young children at primary schools and just saw how hard PTAs have to work to generate income. Mm. And how essential some of that income is because funding only gets you so far. Yeah. So it really was as simple as what can we do to help? And so we started the Giving Machine, and yes, that was many years ago, but it's given away about 2.3 million so far, but the goal really is to get to be giving away £1 million a year or more.
And is it still very much focused on community organisations?
Yes, it is. So it's typically focused on organisations where they've got a sort of digital audience, so they've got some form of audience because we're quite digital, but where really they have sort of amateur or part-time fundraisers. Because if you have full-time fundraisers, you can often leverage tools and mechanisms, and you've got budget to use things that the bigger organisations can. But if you're limited on your resources, you often are scrabbling around for bits and pieces, and you can't keep asking people for more money. Mm. So you need, how can we help in that innovative space to provide solutions that would help?
Okay. And you talked about realising at some point in your life the need or the want to give back. Take me to the place or the time just before then.
Right.
Maybe that was in America, I don't know. But what brought you to the realisation that actually you needed a change in focus?
Well, it really, it's funny because I don't always talk about this because it's quite personal, but obviously we're here talking. When I believe I was still just engaged to my then-to-be wife, Connie, I said to her, one day, I'm going to make a lot of money. And when I do, I'm going to be able to focus on doing something to give back. And it was that. And then when that event did happen, I struggled I thought, well, that's great, but how do I give back? And I volunteered and I did various things. And then I was struggling I'm not quite sure what to do. And then it came to me, well, I like building stuff, so why don't I build something? Mm. But I tend to like being in a team. So luckily fortunately, I was around some other people that felt the same, and we built something together. So it really was perhaps manifesting what I had already felt probably in my early 20s.
Yeah. And you said you don't often talk about it or don't like talking about it. What aspect of that makes you uncomfortable?
Well, I suppose it just feels a little bit like a story. Do you know what I mean? It feels like you felt this, you followed it through. It sounds too fictional, but it is the truth.
Yeah. truth is often stranger than fiction. What were you doing in the US? So you grew up in the US, or part of your
Well, I
childhood
moved.
was in the US?
Well, part of my I suppose I grew up in many places because my father was in the forces. So I went to school in Germany, I suppose London, Middlesex, Lancashire, the States, Scotland, and then back down to, I suppose, Northwood as well. So my childhood was moving around a lot, but part of that was in Ohio as well.
Okay.
So from about age 11 to about 14, just doing the quick maths.
Yeah.
So some quite informative teenage years. And then I was in north of Scotland from, I was about 14 to 17.
Okay. And I've often wondered about kids of, not necessarily of parents who are in the services, but any job that takes parents different places quite frequently. What do you think that gave you?
Well, it gave me a lot of trauma and angst, that's for sure.
And you will come on to that.
But only because you're starting a new school, you're
Yeah.
always a new kid.
Yeah.
But I think when I look back on it, the positive aspects was you get used to being dropped into situations where you don't know people. And I'm an only child, so in some ways to form any friends, you're going to have to go out, even knocking on people's doors saying, "Hi, I'm new."
Yeah.
And you can do that within a sort of forces environment. It's not quite so odd because people are moving in and out all the time. It also gave me an understanding at certain points you sort of feel parachuted in, and many of the points you're coming in, if you think about the sort of tiers of social structure in a school, you're coming in mid to low, right? Yeah. So you kind of know what it's like to be mid to low. Once or twice you might be mid to high for whatever reason. So you get a chance to sample things at very different points and know what it feels like. And I suppose that's one of the things I look back on. And the different cultures. I think the other aspect that gave me, what was my universal weapon of choice, which was going to be humour.
Yeah. So I just want to kind of go back a couple of beats. So you were often dropped in mid to low, and it seems to me that's you got to know what it felt like to be in that layer. But did it also give you? I imagine you ended up feeling comfortable in that place as well, because that's the place you were kind of often starting from. But did it give you aspirations to move upwards?
Well, I tell you what it did give me aspirations for is I knew that if I felt very strongly that I wanted to be able to choose the people I was around, because there is a frustration at not being able to choose. Yeah. And the only way I could think of to choose was to be able to be really excellent at something, so that I was pretty good at school. And so I threw myself into that because I thought, actually, my ticket to choose who I'm around will be based on some aspect of that performance.
Did that drive directly or indirectly lead you to Silicon Valley in the end?
No, do you know, not totally. I think what drove me to that was I was driven, but I was driven about adding value, and in some way, shape or form, and a very strong sense of, I suppose, fairness. For whatever that meant. For some reason, that really strikes a chord in me, what's fair, reasonable. And I was working in a company in London, and I happened to just say to my wife, look, I'd love to work in the States. And she was quite connected to home. And she said, well, look, if the opportunity comes, perhaps we'll go for a year. That day, I went into my boss at the time, and I said, you know, I'd love the chance to work in the States. We were in an international company. And he said, well, it's funny, because I've just got 2 places opening up. Where would you like to go, Chicago or San Jose?
Wow. So
there was almost like wow, this just unfolded. I was very fortunate. Yeah. I chose San Jose because, although you'd say naturally, would you choose? But one was, my head told me go to Chicago, because that's where the headquarters of the business was. If I was playing the politics game, that would have been the good choice. But the people I wanted to work around were the data people who weren't always treated as first-class citizens amongst the other telecoms people at the time. but I wanted to work around with them. I thought that's where I could add the most value. So I went to San Jose.
So this kind of reflects that desire to choose who you want to be with, choose who you want to work with.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so from San Jose, then...
Well, I was in San Jose with this one company.
Yeah.
We were working on some really interesting technology. I was deploying it, which was the forerunner of broadband. And then there was a spin-out organisation to form a startup, and I was asked to be part of that. So I was then asked to be one of the 8 co-founders of a startup called Northpoint. And then that was the sort of dream journey from 8 people and flotation and all the stuff that goes on with that.
So I'm assuming that the 1 year that Connie said that you'd be in the States...
It stretched to 4.
4?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was banking on that, but I was always on, in fact, that brings up a point, I was always honest with the startup I was in. I said, look, at that time it was just 1 more year. And I said, I'll give you 1 more year. But I said to them, and also my team when I hired them, you will see me going home at 5 or 5:30, but we're not part of an expat community here. And my wife's on her own with me. I want to invest in our marriage because if I have to choose between job and marriage, I'm choosing marriage. So it's in all of our interest that I do this.
Yeah. And that's, I don't know whether that's a ballsy conversation to have in the startup world or in any business environment, but I think it takes courage in a business environment to be as vulnerable as you were being with your colleagues.
Well, I thought it best to be honest because I didn't want them to be disappointed. Don't get me wrong, I did work into the evenings and said I will do whatever it takes, but I want to be home for core time with my wife. And it saw me in really good stead, and it meant that some of my people that worked for me might see me leaving early-ish, which is often an unheard thing. But I said, don't worry, I will be logging on and I get up early in the morning, but this is why I'm doing this.
Yeah.
And nobody ever said anything that was an issue.
And I'm imagining that level of transparency and honesty breeds loyalty in team as well. Was that your experience of it?
It was. I was just very blessed. I had a great team. But around that time, because I was quite young to take on some of the responsibilities I had, I also needed some extra wisdom. So I read a number of leadership books, specifically ones by Stephen Covey, which were just amazing to get some of that. And I also had a mentor that I took on as well, just because I thought I really want to be good at this leadership, because I knew the theory, but practice is somewhat different.
Yes, yeah. And I think there is a temptation sometimes, and certainly when you're younger, to think I can do everything by myself, and it's maybe a sign of weakness if I ask for help. And this is across the board, from a work perspective, from a mental health perspective. People don't always understand that they need to ask for help.
Yeah.
But the penny had dropped for you quite early on. Was there anything specific that had happened, to that point, which gave you that insight?
Well, I think even reading other people's wisdom, you realise a lot of it they've written down because it's experiential.
Yeah.
And so you can soak that in, but of course it's experiential on the issues they've faced. But of course you're going to be in the moment. And sometimes just buying yourself a little bit of time to then come up with a better decision. One example of that is that when we were co-founding the business, one of the sort of best internet engineers I'd ever met felt that he should have been head of engineering.
Yeah.
And I was asked to be head of engineering. And I didn't want to get off on the bad foot, and I got some advice from my mentor. I thought, how do I handle this? Because I want to make sure we go forward. And I got some great advice, which was the thing that this colleague was really brilliant at is architecture. And if he was going to be saddled with managing a large team, this was going to take him away from architecture. So we came up with a structure where he was a chief scientist, I believe is the title we gave, but he had architecture sign-off, whereas I managed the resources. And that worked out as a great partnership. because I said, do you really want to be saddled with, is this, because actually it would be distracting from what he's brilliant at.
Yeah.
Whereas I can say, look, I'm not brilliant at the engineering, but I think I can lead people and pull together teams and structure. And we got on super well, and that was laid the groundwork for what I felt was a really good forward structure. So it was a win-win.
Moving forwards in time, you had 4 years in Silicon Valley, or in the US generally, and then came back to the UK. And I'm imagining from that startup environment, really fast-paced, very exciting, then starting again. And then I know you're used to starting again because that's your experience. But what was that like coming back to the UK?
Well, we came back to the UK mainly at the time because my wife Connie was pregnant with our first child, and we knew we wanted to settle in the UK to begin the family thing, and we left it to the end of the sort of second trimester. As it so happened, that timing was geared by that, but I had to exit out of the company, but at that time it had just floated, and I had to sell my shares. Little did I know that I had an amazing exit, and then the crash happened about 2 or 3 months after I'd exited.
Yeah.
But it was the timing of the sort of Alexandra being on the way. Excuse me. And so I went pretty much straight into another startup in London. But it, for one reason or another, it didn't work out. There was some legal and regulatory stuff, there's team stuff, whatever. So this, what I thought was the standard startup journey clearly wasn't. So this one didn't work out. And I then actually found it very hard. I bumbled around for a while, and I wasn't quite sure what to do. I volunteered, I did stuff. And I did find this, okay, how do I find stuff again? And then I got a contracting job working in another sort of technology company, the head of operations. And that was fun, but I was working quite long hours, 4 days a week. And it was at that point my wife said, why are you doing this? And
because remembering the conversation, you'd said to her...
Well, also she was saying, you don't have to do this.
Yeah.
And we wanted to start a family and you're not here. And I was a bit annoyed, actually, because it was a good question.
Yeah.
And the only answer I had was because this is what I know how to do. And that really isn't a good answer, because I hadn't really thought. I'd just done. And I tried a number of things to repeat and do stuff, but I was actually trying to stay on the hamster wheel.
Yeah.
And that was at that point, I said, right, I'm going to stop.
Yeah.
So I then got a part-time job locally in a small telecoms reseller. So I had something filling my sort of mental stuff. And then I had plenty of time to be dad, which is, do the swimming lessons, do the taking to school. And that really was quite a radical change. And it was the beginning of connecting into community that then instigated those, okay, how do I help? What do I do to make a difference?
Yeah. But that thought that you articulated, this is the only thing I know how to do. I'm just thinking about my own experience. So I was a lawyer for 20 years, and then eventually moved into coaching and podcasting. But I've spoken to lots of people, whether in the legal professional outside, who have been doing what they've been doing for a number of years, not happy, want to make a change, but the thought is one of many. Well, this is the only thing.
This is my skill set.
That's right.
Yeah, this is the only set of tools I have. So it.
But is that true for you? For you, was it true? I'm assuming it wasn't true. It's just that you needed a different perspective, a broader way of thinking about yourself and the world around you.
Well, there's that, but then there's also the when I went to work for the local telecoms reseller. So there were like 3 of us in the office, and there is an element also, and I'll be honest, as to say, there's a sort of an element. I'm trying to think of you've lost the label. So in one, you've launched a company, it's been successful, you've managed large teams, people want you to speak on podiums, and then suddenly your badge, the role you have, is relatively nothing.
Yeah.
And so there is a loss of, I don't know, audience, a loss of whatever you could call it. So, and actually, once you got rid of that, or at least dealt with that, say, actually, everything's fine. But there is an element of, I've got to lose some of the audience or the following or whatever it is I have in this realm to then go somewhere else where you've got to start. It's almost like going back to the bottom of a rung.
Yeah.
Not that you're necessarily looking for all of that, but there is an element of that.
Yeah. And I'm imagining, so the loss of the stuff that you've known.
Well, you could call it status, if you like.
Yes, yeah. I'm imagining that's on the one hand frightening, and on the other hand can be liberating as well. And we label ourselves all the time.
Well, it's liberating once you know that's not you. But an example I found was when I'd come out of the work and I would go, we might go out with some neighbours or friends, and I'm working locally and everyone's talking about their jobs and they're going in. Suddenly you get caught up in labels, status, people,
Yes.
and you can't help but feel, and no one's asking you, and especially if all you're doing is dad stuff, it's a very funny time because you're not going to get invited to the coffee mornings with the mums, right? Not that but fair now. But then you're not part of any work groups, so there's a belonging piece.
Yes.
But it's a good time to reflect. Okay, what does that say about me?
Yeah.
And it's an interesting discovery, saying actually, no, your husband, your dad, you've got community stuff you do, that's important too. The other stuff was great and I really enjoyed it for the time, but actually there's other challenges. But sometimes there is a bit of, I suppose it's almost like a bereavement cycle.
Yeah. And did it send you into a dark place for a period of time?
I think if for a number, yes, I wouldn't say dark, but a bit of flailing around of, okay, what do I do next? It was all so clear. I always felt my path, and suddenly it was just like, okay, now you can choose. Where do you choose? I don't know. So there were a lot of things I tried and didn't work.
Yeah.
And I think it's only really in the last 2 or 3 years I feel about as settled as I've ever been.
That's interesting. Why is that?
Because I separated out the need to do some of the charitable stuff I do, and I do have a need to, or a want, a desire to earn some income.
Yeah.
And there's more to it than just the money. It's a value exchange. And now that I've found a mechanism to do that through my sort of teaching, coaching, facilitating work with businesses, I find then I'm getting both, and I love that.
Yeah.
And I've got time to spend with family and do some of the other stuff. So I feel all areas are pretty balanced now.
One of the things I love talking about on this podcast is success, and what does success mean to people. And I'm imagining for your younger self, maybe in the US, working on the startup, success would have looked, in a particular, looked, you would have built up a picture of it looking like this. But then it sounds like you say, you're as settled as you've ever been now. And so I'm imagining also that your definition of success has changed dramatically from that period to now. Would that be right?
It's interesting because I'm not sure. I think I've settled on the phrase, which I borrowed from others, is to do what I love with people I love to make a huge difference. And even in the startup, I felt I was on a mission to prove you can win the right way. And
by having those elements.
by having leading with integrity, really looking after your people, loving it, all the stuff that I now teach others. But I wanted to prove that could be done, and I felt I did. And the people in my teams really resonated that, loved that, and we really, really performed and had a lot of fun doing that. But it takes a lot of energy from you, and that was a very magical experience. But when you also have the drive to say, I want to do something charitable, I wanted to do something charitable, but I was hoping it was going to earn more than it did. I pay everyone else, but I don't necessarily pay myself. And that felt a bit of a failure, if you like. So to plug that gap to say, actually, no, I can go and do some other things, that actually I'm successful here. I don't need to lump all the needs on one thing.
Yeah.
I can balance them, if you like. But I have to say, the work, fortunately, with the work that I did over a number of years, it did give me what I loved the people I worked with, and I was always driven, how do we do a great job? How do we have a lot of fun? How do we win the right way?
How do we win the right way? I love that.
And win doesn't presuppose someone else has got to lose.
Yeah.
It's just the feeling of winning. You could call it success or whatever.
When you were leading, and maybe when you're leading these days, again, coming back to the theme of the podcast, which is about showing how people are successful despite the insecurities that they have, that we all have, because we're all human beings. What insecurities do you have about your ability to give back, or your ability to lead a team, or whatever it might be?
That's interesting. What insecurities do I have? I think sometimes when things don't quite go the way you want them to, or you get some negative feedback, it kind of just prods that fear monster that basically says, yeah, you've done all these things, but deep down you're crap, aren't you? You know, and so that, yes, of course, that does happen and still does occur. But then you have to go through that evidence piece of saying, well, hold on, is that evidential? But it's an emotional versus logical discussion. And I think I'm much more at peace with that. But there were elements of, it's all of a sudden, people are going to find you out. Yeah. But fortunately, I think if you are open and honest and vulnerable, there's no skeletons. And if you, in the moment of choice, if you do the right thing and ask yourself, what is the right thing to do, you kind of don't leave many doors for people or things to happen to you that you couldn't justify. Say, well, okay, I made the best decision I could at the time. What more could I have done? It might have been the wrong one now that I look back, but actually at that moment in time, I think it's when you make knee-jerk reactions, you're not motivated by the right thing, whatever that is, that leads you to more problems. Yeah. So I think knowing that has helped me a lot.
I love that, being open and honest and vulnerable. And I think those are definitely ideals I aspire to as well, but I also see for many men, especially in leadership positions, it's a really difficult thing to achieve, the vulnerability especially. Have you seen that as well?
Definitely. But one of the things that did happen to me in the stateside, because Connie had given me that, well, it's a rolling 1 year type thing. When I was hiring people into positions to work for me, I was hiring people thinking, well, I've got share options in this company, so I need to make sure I hire people better than me, because I'm not going to be here forever. I know this. Yeah. So when I was hiring them, I'm telling them, I'm hiring you because you're better than me. And so let's just get that out of the way first, so you know. I know that, you know that, we don't need to pretend anything else. All right? But I'm in this function, and therefore this is what I'm going to do to support you. I found that honesty actually, for whatever reason, really worked. And I was being honest, thinking, well, look, if I'm not around, I need to make sure this functions really. So I need to hire people that can do what I do and do the function far better than I could. Yeah. And that was really cemented. Well, it's obvious when you look back now, but that's not always the way people would hire.
And in your capacity now as a mentor, coach, advisor when working with male clients, are those conversations that you're having to try and help your clients be more transparent, be more vulnerable?
Yes, and I think because I work in a team environment, so I work with a whole leadership team, it's a little easier sometimes because you're not doing one-to-one, you're watching people in a team. So actually you're trying to help them be more honest and open. Again, I think my background of using perhaps humour is one of my weapons of choice. I'll use the word weapon, but toolkit, because that can diffuse things quite quickly, but you can actually get people to be honest. So I do find that's a key bit of it, especially in very male-dominated teams. Yeah, can be, and I know that's a very broad brush, but it's actually learning to be honest about issues, about stuff, and facing what is often just basic people relationship stuff. But it translates so much into our personal lives as well. So sometimes I use a personal life analogy or example, because actually it's dealing with people and issues.
Yeah. Changing tack a little bit. So giving back, serving others, that's a thread throughout much of your life, your working life, certainly. I'm wondering how much of that is influenced or inspired by the example of your dad, who was in the forces, in the services.
I think much of it was he was a very giving person and would always try and look at things from someone else's point of view. I think the other aspect, that having moved around a lot, you saw a lot of people had so much to give or capability, but were constrained by where they were in a hierarchy or the peer set they were in.
Yeah.
And I felt spotting that would be, well, if you can see that, you almost have a duty. How can you help other people unlock their opportunities? And I suppose that's part of the giving back piece, is helping others to unlock their capabilities.
Yeah.
Whether that's a conversation, whether that's mentorship, whether it's just being there, listening. And there's a deep joy in that.
Yeah, for sure. So this may be a stereotype, but for a lot of people who are givers, they give to themselves last.
Yes.
Can you speak about
Well,
that?
there is a phrase I remember hearing, and I thought, as I say, I don't always have my own phrases, but I'll borrow others. It was, givers need to know when to stop giving, because takers never know when to stop taking. So there is an element of self-care, and I think understanding at what point is it giving, or what point is it actually draining you so much. And that's a difficult one, because it depends whether you're giving because it's almost dutiful, it's a duty-bound giving. And I think for whatever reason over time I learned, and Connie was very good at helping me understand this, where you might have to draw a line. Yeah. And that will be, have you given enough or done enough that you feel comfortable? But you might have to say, but if it's starting to feel like a burden, that's a sign to say, hold on, you've got to really go inside and look at what's going on here.
Yeah, I love that. There's also, for me, maybe it's a subtle distinction, but for people that give a lot, they don't think about themselves enough. They don't think about what they need.
Yes, you're right. And I suppose that's perhaps sometimes, if it's over giving, are you trying to make up for something? Is this giving to something about giving you self-worth, or is it just part of you? And I suppose we have that about all our traits.
Yes.
So we really, and there's no right or wrong. So I suppose it's why do you give? And there is an exchange, because you want to know your giving makes a difference. Yeah. But you don't necessarily need the receipt, as it were.
Yeah, it's a really interesting. I've thought about this quite a bit. Do any of us really give purely for the sake of giving?
Well, I think that's a difficult one. It's a bit like, you've let someone out in front of you in the road, and they go like that, and everything's good, the world's brilliant. When they just don't acknowledge you, it's like, or you get sarcastic. Yeah. So you're right, but then on the other hand, it's that happiness piece is a bit like, if you're trying to share happiness and someone else becomes happy, it becomes a chain reaction, and therefore you're part of a chain reaction. If it falls flat, you can't help perhaps feel a bit disappointed. So it's difficult, isn't it?
It's a difficult one, that, for sure. So how do you take care of yourself?
So I spend a fair bit of time now in daily meditation and practice to ground myself, to make sure I feel very centered. I have a weekly process where I actually try and... So I love starting processes, but I'm not always good at completing them. But at this one I've kept at for many years. I consider my week, and I think in each of my roles, how am I doing? So in my role as a husband, as a father, and I just code it green, red, amber. Do I need to spend a bit more time on some of these things? Then I would look into my role as a community person, as a giving machine, a piece in my sort of consulting piece.
Yeah. And just pausing there, do you ask for feedback in those aspects as well? So do you have people helping. So because it's a very subjective. How am I
Yes.
doing? So
Well, I suppose it is, but I suppose you have a feeling, and hopefully,
Yeah.
if you're in tune,
yeah,
you generally know. So it might be, have I connected to certain friends and people I want to connect to? So it's being proactive about the key relationships and connections that I have,
yeah,
because I know that if sometimes for me, if it's out of sight, it's out of mind. So I need to make sure it's in sight.
Yeah.
So I do that. But yes, with my wife, for example, we try and go out for a quarterly brunch, and we talk about how we're feeling, especially now that the children, well, young adults, are older and very much more self-sufficient. We can focus a bit on what do we want from our lives, and how we've been doing, and then what do we want for the next 6 to 12 months. So I think with all of these things, you're absolutely right, is how can we get feedback on how things are doing?
yeah. And it's another great example of how of modelling vulnerability, right? For other people, it's not always easy, especially for men, especially in the context of a relationship, to ask for feedback on themselves.
I think one of the first things I did notice, and it's funny because I love my dad to bits, but one of his traits was he found it very hard to say sorry. And that's one thing that I do see. It's an unequivocal, sorry, I messed up, or words to that effect, without the but.
Yeah.
And it's hard, but there's a strength in it to say, yeah, I messed up.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've found that for myself over the years, owning my own mistakes.
Yeah.
Without, as you say, without
the but.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a really, and being vulnerable in front of other people actually is incredible. It's really powerful. It's not a sign of weakness.
No, it
as many
becomes
people think.
a strength, and it's one of those things that, if you were presenting and something goes wrong, say, oh, I'm really sorry it's gone wrong.
Yeah.
Not flustered and just, okay, it's the way it's unfolded. Yeah. So I think that's a very key bit in a relationship. So when you're saying about being vulnerable, I think one of the first steps is, can you actually say sorry for stuff you've messed up on, and then do what you can to put it right.
Okay, so there's the meditation, there's the kind of quarterly
the weekly
review.
Those are I suppose those are the main things, and perhaps laughing a lot.
Say a bit more.
Well, not just generally laughing, the spontaneous laughter, but just seeking to enjoy life and see the fun side in it. Yeah,
life can be obviously very serious. One of my previous guests has worked in kind of arenas in her life which most people would just completely shy away from, and she said that the people she worked with, they were able to find the light, the joy in life, and that was a great inspiration to her. So if they can do it, we can all do
sure.
it. No,
well, I mean, one of the because when you said one of the examples I was thinking about still makes me laugh, even though it's a bit morbid. Is so when I was with my father when he died at home, and that was an amazing experience to be with him through that journey. And the undertaker's going to pick him up, and they're trying to get him down the stairs, and he's got these really hard stairs. And the two undertakers they sent were, I mean, they looked well past sell by date, if you know what I mean. The poor things. It was a really hot day, and one of them slipped down the stairs and almost but instead of dropping my dad, crashed into the wall. And so there's three of us at the bottom stairs: myself, my daughter, and my aunt. And I'm really worried about the undertaker being injured, because let's face it, it's not going to hurt my dad, right? So I'm really worried about that. They're mortified, which is kind of an interesting use of the word, but anyway, they're mortified by this whole experience, and so sorry. My aunt, of course, is completely mortified as well, traumatized probably, and fortunately my daughter's got a similar sense of humour. We're seeing this is straight out of something off the telly, this is. So anyway, it was just one of those sorts of events. You kind of think, well, the bit of you just says, this is funny, but I felt really for the guy who slipped, because he was going to probably be quite significantly bruised. But of course, he's probably gone back saying, you won't believe what's happened today.
Yeah.
But these poor fellas all dressed one of the hottest days in the year with their gear, trying to get this body down the stairs. Just anyway, it just comes to mind is there's always something funny if you look at it.
Yeah, and what a beautiful way to end the conversation with laughter and joy. Thank you so much for coming in. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, thank you.